Welcome to Woven in True Crime, where every thread of mystery reveals an even darker truth. What you are about to hear is based on a true story, a case that shook a small town and left deep scars on its residents. While the events are real, the names and places have been changed to protect the identity of the people involved. In 2009, a series of brutal murders began, and each detail seemed more terrifying than the last. The victims were young women, methodically strangled, and the man behind these horrific crimes? Jacob Carter, a predator who chose his victims with a disturbing pattern, all reminding him of one person, his own mother. The case seemed resolved when Jacob was arrested, but the disappearance of Monica Rivera left a void that remains unfilled to this day. What really happened? What is Jacob hiding? Prepare yourself for a story where not all secrets have been revealed, and the mystery continues to haunt the town to this day. On a Wednesday morning, Huntington, Texas, was brutally shaken from its tranquility. Rachel Bennett, a 28-year-old mother, was found dead inside her silver SUV, parked on a secluded road. The most disturbing detail? She had been strangled with her own necklace, while in the back seat, her baby cried incessantly, unharmed but alone. The first officers to arrive were paralyzed by the scene. The baby's cries cut through the air like a grim echo, while Rachel's body remained motionless in the front seat, her necklace embedded in her pale skin. The officers opened the car door with trembling hands, stunned by the brutality of the crime. The baby was rushed to medical care, while the young mother's body awaited forensic examination, trapped in that terrible scenario. For a town as peaceful as Huntington, where rarely anything out of the ordinary happened, Rachel's death was a deep blow. Rachel was more than a victim, she was a beloved figure. Known for her kindness and active participation in community events, her absence was immediately felt. Fear began to quietly grow among the residents, who couldn't believe that something so cruel could happen so close to their homes. The streets, once busy, began to empty. People locked their doors, something almost unheard of in the small town. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt that the horror that had overtaken Huntington was far from over. However, as the days passed, small clues began to emerge. Almost insignificant details that had been overlooked started to stand out, and nothing was what it seemed. However, as the days passed, the first clues began to appear, and nothing was what it seemed. Rachel Bennett was a familiar and beloved figure in Huntington. At 28, she divided her time between caring for her young son and participating in community events. Always seen in the town's parks or at church gatherings, she was completely devoted to her family and always present at local activities. Her husband, a mechanic who worked in a neighboring town, was also highly respected by the residents, and together they formed a family that represented the best of Huntington. Huntington was the kind of place where time seemed to pass slowly. With its wooden houses surrounded by old oak trees and porches stretching out in peaceful afternoons, the town seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. There, the sound of a door closing was more common than the sound of police sirens. The streets were peaceful, and daily problems rarely went beyond discussions about the closing of a local diner or preparations for the annual fair. The news of Rachel's death changed everything. Perplexity gripped the town, and the residents gathered, confused and scared, trying to understand what had happened. Statements from friends and neighbors painted a portrait of a woman who was always kind and dedicated. "She brought me cookies every week," a neighbor commented with tear-filled eyes. "And she helped at the church fair every month." To them, Rachel was irreplaceable, and the idea that something so terrible could happen to someone so present in their lives was inconceivable. But as the days passed, the initial shock began to give way to fear. Family gatherings on porches were interrupted by furtive glances through windows. Parents pulled their children inside earlier, and an unusual silence hung over the streets at nightfall. Everyone felt that something had changed. If this could happen to Rachel, no one was safe. Theories began to emerge. A stranger had been seen walking near the road on the day of the crime, and others mentioned a suspicious car speeding down the street that night. Each clue, however, seemed vague and confusing, as if a puzzle were being assembled, but essential pieces were missing. What no one expected, however, was that Rachel's death would be just the beginning of a sequence of even darker events. In the following days, another woman would disappear, and the town would begin to realize that the nightmare was far from over. But what the police found next turned a simple disappearance into a much darker mystery than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Rachel Bennett's death was still in its early stages when, just 5 days later, the police were called to another disturbing scene. Laura Jones, a 31-year-old woman, had disappeared the previous night. The next morning, her body was found inside her car, strangled with the seatbelt. The scene was eerily similar to Rachel's murder. Laura was also alone, with no signs of struggle, as if death had come quickly and silently. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. The officers who arrived at the scene were shaken, as if reliving the terror of days before. Laura's body lay lifeless in the driver's seat, her eyes fixed on a terrible void. The seatbelt wrapped around her neck was the only evidence of violence. Like Rachel, she had been killed without leaving signs of resistance, only deepening the mystery of how the killer was able to overpower his victims. With Laura's discovery, the police could no longer ignore the pattern. What seemed like an isolated crime now appeared to be part of something much larger. Huntington was at the mercy of a serial killer. The pressure on the investigators increased drastically, and the small town's police team, unprepared to handle a series of homicides, began to feel the weight of expectations. The clues remained scarce, but a light emerged during a re-evaluation of the crime scene. One of the forensic technicians found an organic substance on the floor of Laura's car, something initially dismissed as irrelevant. However, a more detailed analysis revealed the unexpected: traces of a ruptured colostomy bag. Suddenly, the police had a concrete lead. The killer carried a unique characteristic, something that could significantly narrow down the list of suspects. The investigative team sprang into action, cross-referencing medical data from the region to identify men who used colostomy bags. The sense that they were finally closing in on a solution filled the room with tension. However, this clue alone was not enough to ensure the criminal's capture, and the fear of another imminent attack loomed over the officers. With each passing day, the danger became more real. Meanwhile, panic spread through Huntington. The already deserted streets seemed haunted as night fell. The few lights that flickered in the windows were like watchful eyes. People avoided leaving their homes, and the parks, once full of life, were now empty. Residents began to doubt the safety of their own routines as fear grew like a shadow that no one could ignore. With the colostomy bag clue in hand, the police wasted no time. Men who had been near the crime scenes or who matched the medical profile were called in for questioning. But the interviews only generated more doubts. Contradictory testimonies further confused the investigation. Some said they had seen a man loitering in the area, while others described a suspicious car that didn't match known clues. Frustration among the investigators grew with each new statement. Then, another key piece emerged. Desperate for any breakthrough, the investigators began cross-referencing the victims' phone data. To their surprise, they discovered that Rachel and Laura's cell phones were not with the victims; they had been taken by the killer. More disturbingly, the phones were used after their deaths, in distant and random locations. What seemed like a minor detail took on a macabre importance. The phones were not just stolen items but trophies. The killer kept them as reminders of his crimes, a sign of his control and power. This discovery brought a new layer of horror to the case. The police now had the opportunity to track the criminal's movements. However, what they were about to uncover would go far beyond what anyone could imagine. But what the police found next turned a simple disappearance into a much darker mystery than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation deepened, new details began to emerge, leading the inquiry down unexpected paths. The revelation that the killer kept the victims' phones as trophies prompted a shift in police strategies. Now, with access to the phone location data, the investigators realized that the criminal had moved to different parts of the region after the murders, as if trying to confuse trackers. However, one peculiarity caught the detectives' attention: all the stolen phones were turned off within a very short time frame, and, before being discarded in random locations, the devices briefly connected to cell towers located near the home of Jacob Carter, a man who until then had not raised any suspicion. Jacob Carter, born in 1978, was a man leading an apparently ordinary life in Huntington. He lived with his wife and 2 children and worked at a mechanic's shop in town. To most people, Jacob was just another member of the community, discreet and always in the background of social activities. However, as the investigation into his past deepened, the detectives uncovered something unsettling. Jacob had grown up in a broken home, with an abusive and absent mother. His childhood was marked by episodes of domestic violence, which eventually led to his institutionalization at the age of 16. Files on Jacob revealed a history of violent and unstable behavior, especially toward female figures who reminded him of his mother. And then, the key piece fell into place: all the murdered women bore a striking physical resemblance. They were young, with brown hair and soft features. All of them reminded Jacob, in some way, of his mother. This revelation shed new light on the case. The investigators realized that the killer did not choose his victims randomly, but rather based on a psychological pattern. Jacob's profile began to align with the information already collected, and the tension in the investigation room grew. Jacob was now the prime suspect, but the definitive proof needed to tie everything together was still missing. At this point, the investigators decided to follow a new course of action: track the whereabouts of the stolen phones and make a direct connection to Jacob. To do this, they needed a search warrant to search his home and possibly uncover the phones he had kept as trophies. By now, the tension among the investigators was palpable. They knew they were closing in on the truth, but they were also aware that any misstep could cost another life. While waiting for the warrant's approval, the police increased surveillance on Jacob, monitoring his movements and interactions. Meanwhile, more disturbing details began to emerge. During a more detailed analysis of the victims' bodies, forensics found small scratch marks on their wrists, something that had gone unnoticed until then. This indicated that, although there were no significant signs of struggle, the victims had been restrained in some way before being strangled. This suggested that the killer had some form of control over his victims, whether physical or psychological, before committing the murder. In addition, during a more thorough examination of Rachel Bennett's crime scene, one of the investigators found a small silver bracelet that did not belong to her. The bracelet, seemingly insignificant at first glance, was dirty and half buried in the mud near the car. When sent for analysis, the results indicated that the item belonged to Monica Rivera, a woman reported missing months earlier, but whose body had never been found. This raised the terrible suspicion that Jacob might be involved in other crimes still unresolved. These discoveries brought a new wave of terror over Huntington. The residents, who had previously feared a killer on the loose, now began to realize that the danger was much greater and deeper than they had imagined. The streets were deserted, and distrust hung in the air. Any stranger, anyone who wasn't a familiar face, was viewed with suspicion. Huntington had transformed from a peaceful town into a community haunted by fear. As the police prepared to confront Jacob, one final detail came to light. The examination of the ruptured colostomy bag in one of the victims' cars revealed traces of DNA. With this new evidence in hand, the investigators were ready to act. But then the evidence unearthed a long-buried secret, something no one was prepared to face. The case, which already seemed complex and disturbing, was about to become even darker. And then the evidence unearthed a long-buried secret, something no one was prepared to face. With the search warrant finally in hand, the Huntington police prepared for one of the most delicate operations they had ever conducted. Jacob Carter, now the prime suspect, was under constant surveillance, but up to that moment, the investigators still needed indisputable evidence to ensure his arrest. The tension was palpable. Every step had to be carefully planned to prevent him from realizing he was being monitored and acting in desperation. At dawn, the police surrounded Jacob's house. His wife and children were inside, unaware of what was about to happen. When the officers entered, searching the house from top to bottom, the atmosphere was one of absolute silence. Everyone was tense, waiting for the moment when something concrete would emerge. And it was in the basement that they found what they needed. There, hidden in a small locked box, were the cell phones of Rachel Bennett, Laura Jones, and other victims. The devices, carefully stored, were dirty but intact. For the investigators, this was the missing proof. Jacob collected the phones as trophies, a symbol of his control over these women. But what they found next was even more disturbing. Hidden at the bottom of the box was a notebook, worn with age, containing detailed notes about each of the victims. Dates, times, physical characteristics, everything was there. Even more shocking, there were descriptions of women who had not yet been found. Names that had never surfaced in the investigations until that moment. Jacob had been killing for much longer than the police had imagined, and now they had in their hands the exact record of his actions. When Jacob was taken in for questioning, he remained silent for a long time. His expressions revealed no emotion. He simply stared at the investigators, as if daring them to discover more. However, the pressure increased when the details of the notebook were presented. The police now had something he couldn't deny, the evidence was there, and there was no more escape. After hours of interrogation, something unexpected happened. Jacob began to speak. In a calm voice, almost without emotion, he confessed to the murders of Rachel, Laura, and other women whose bodies had not yet been found. But instead of delving into the details of the crimes, he shifted the conversation to his childhood. Jacob spoke about his mother, describing her as a cold and abusive figure, someone who had left him emotionally devastated. It was clear that, in his twisted mind, each of his victims was a substitute for his mother, a figure he felt the need to punish repeatedly. Jacob's confession revealed disturbing details. He described how he chose his victims, always women who physically resembled his mother. He revealed that he watched them for weeks, sometimes months, before making his move. When he finally decided to act, he used the victims' own personal items to kill them, feeling that this gave him complete control over their lives and, ironically, their deaths. However, as the confession progressed, the investigators realized that something was missing. Jacob was too methodical, too cold, as if he were omitting something crucial. And then one of the officers brought up a piece of information that had gone unnoticed until then, the bracelet belonging to Monica Rivera, the woman who had been missing for months, whose body had never been found. When confronted with this evidence, Jacob's demeanor changed for the first time. His face hardened, and he refused to say another word. This reaction was enough for the investigators to understand that something much more sinister was involved with Monica. Although Jacob had confessed to the previous murders, something about Monica's death seemed different, more complex. Perhaps he wasn't acting alone, or perhaps there were deeper secrets he preferred to keep buried. The mystery surrounding Monica Rivera began to grow in unexpected ways. With Jacob's confession, the police finally had the necessary evidence to convict him for the murders of Rachel, Laura, and the other identified victims. However, despite the sense of relief that swept through the town, there was an air of unease. The mention of Monica Rivera and Jacob's behavior regarding her specific case raised more questions than answers. The climax of the investigation was here, but as the investigators delved into the details, one question persisted: had Jacob Carter really confessed to everything? And more disturbingly, was someone helping him cover up Monica's disappearance? The most shocking revelation was yet to come, and the case, which seemed closed, had just taken an unexpected turn. Huntington was not yet free from the nightmare that haunted the town. But despite all the answers that emerged, one question still hung in the air: what motivated all of this? And has the whole truth really been revealed? The capture of Jacob Carter brought a momentary sense of relief to Huntington. The streets, once deserted, slowly began to return to normal. People came out of their homes again, but fear still lingered, hidden in whispered conversations between neighbors and in the furtive glances cast at strangers. Jacob was behind bars, but the feeling that something was still out of place hung over the town. Jacob's confessions about the murders of Rachel Bennett, Laura Jones, and other identified victims were detailed and incriminating. He didn't try to deny his guilt, and with the concrete evidence in hand, the stolen cell phones, the notebook with notes, and the DNA found in the colostomy bag, the police were able to quickly build a case against him. Jacob was officially charged and convicted, and the legal process was swift. The town anxiously awaited the outcome in court, hoping that the nightmare would finally come to an end. However, during the trial, something intriguing emerged. Despite Jacob's extensive confession, he continued to refuse to speak about Monica Rivera, the missing woman whose body had never been found. Mentions of Monica provoked a noticeable change in his behavior. Jacob, who had calmly spoken about his other victims, avoided answering any questions related to her. This left the investigators uneasy. Why would he admit to so many murders but avoid talking about Monica? What was different about her case? Prosecutors tried, unsuccessfully, to obtain more information from Jacob about Monica's whereabouts. His reluctance to talk fueled speculation that he may not have acted alone. Could someone else have been involved in her disappearance? An accomplice? Or was there something about Monica that Jacob himself feared to reveal? As these doubts permeated the courtroom, the police continued to investigate possible connections between Jacob and other unidentified victims. The silver bracelet found at Rachel's crime scene, which belonged to Monica, remained one of the few tangible clues linking the two women. But without Monica's body, justice seemed incomplete. Huntington tried to move on, but the shadow of Monica's case still hung over the community. Some families, especially those of the confirmed victims, tried to process their grief and deal with the consequences of Jacob's crimes. For them, the trial offered some closure, but it didn't erase the trauma. Conversations about what Jacob had done continued to echo everywhere, in the streets, in cafes, and in homes at nightfall. The press also didn't let the case die so quickly. Reporters came from all over to cover Jacob Carter's trial, and with each new speculation about Monica Rivera, interest grew. Sensational headlines spoke of a buried secret and unresolved clues, fueling public curiosity and keeping the case alive in the media. The focus on the gaps left by Jacob's confession kept the sense that something crucial was still hidden. Monica's family, on the other hand, clung to the hope that she might still be found, even if the outcome wasn't what they wished for. For them, the lack of answers was an open wound that refused to heal. Every day, the absence of her body became more painful, and the doubts about what really happened that night only increased. Despite Jacob being behind bars, the mystery surrounding Monica Rivera remained unsolved. The case seemed to be closed for most, but for the investigators, one last piece still didn't fit. Something didn't make sense, and the suspicion that an important part of the truth was being hidden continued to haunt both the police and the town. Despite the evidence, a crucial detail still didn't fit. Something was out of place, and perhaps the story wasn't over. With Jacob Carter imprisoned and convicted, Huntington tried to return to normalcy. The streets, once deserted, gradually regained some movement, but the atmosphere of uncertainty and mistrust still lingered. People resumed their routines, but they knew that Monica Rivera's case was not closed. Sensational headlines continued to circulate, with titles like "Unrevealed Secrets," "What is Jacob hiding about Monica Rivera?" and "Did Jacob Carter act alone?" Police still seek answers. The discovery of Monica's bones in an abandoned field on the outskirts of town reignited fear. When the news spread, Huntington once again fell into a grim silence. Monica's parents, devastated, watched helplessly as the truth they most feared was revealed. The hope that she might be alive was destroyed in an instant, replaced by unbearable pain. "We knew she wasn't coming back," Monica's mother murmured at a press conference, "but this is too much." The police, who had hoped to close the case with Jacob's capture, now faced new doubts. Forensic results from Monica's bones revealed something disturbing, signs that she had been kept alive for some time before being killed. Unlike the other victims, Monica had not been killed quickly. This detail raised suspicions that Jacob may not have acted alone, or perhaps that there was more to the story than he was willing to confess. For Police Chief Mark Henderson, the case had become an obsession. "We found the bones," he repeated to himself, "but what are we leaving behind?" The silver bracelet, the only link between Monica and the other victims, seemed to be a clue leading to something deeper, something they had not yet uncovered. The frustration of not finding concrete answers gnawed at the investigators, who found themselves trapped in a puzzle with missing pieces. Jacob Carter, in his cell, maintained the same silence he had since the beginning. He confessed to the murders of Rachel Bennett, Laura Jones, and the other victims, but whenever Monica's name was mentioned, he fell silent. It was as if she represented something darker, something he couldn't or didn't want to reveal. When confronted with the new forensic details, his face hardened, and he avoided the investigators' gaze, refusing to respond. In town, theories about an accomplice began to gain traction. Rumors spread that Jacob wasn't acting alone. What if someone was helping him, the residents asked, growing more suspicious by the day. Whispers about a figure who always lurked in the shadows began to circulate. Perhaps someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, someone still walking the streets of Huntington, in plain sight, but invisible. As the town struggled to overcome the trauma, the press kept the case alive with new theories and speculations. Reporters camped out on the outskirts, ready to capture any new information. Headlines questioned the police's ability to solve the case, and each new report reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Huntington, once a peaceful town, now seemed haunted by a recent past that refused to stay buried. The discovery of Monica's bones brought partial closure, but for her family, there was no relief. Knowing that she had been kept alive longer before being killed deepened the pain. Every detail revealed seemed only to reinforce the cruel reality that crucial pieces of the puzzle surrounding her death were still missing. For many residents, Jacob's capture represented the end of a nightmare, but for others, especially those closest to the victims, there was a lingering sense that the story was far from over. Jacob's silence and the mystery surrounding Monica had cast a lasting shadow. The case of Monica Rivera had become more than just a crime, it was a symbol of secrets still buried somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. Even after Jacob's conviction, questions remained. Why was Monica treated differently? Who, if not Jacob, was involved? And why did the killer refuse to talk about her? Huntington, even as it tried to move on, still lived under the shadow of these unresolved mysteries. The town, marked by the crimes, was no longer the same. The invisible scars left by the murders were evident in daily interactions, in the wary glances, and in the careful conversations. Huntington seemed to be waiting for something else to happen, as if, Even with Jacob behind bars, the threat was still lurking. The residents still whispered to each other, had Jacob really said everything he knew? Or were there deeper secrets, buried with Monica, still waiting to be discovered? But to this day, the questions persist: what really happened that night? And have all the secrets truly been revealed?